I always loved bugs. I thought they were just so fascinating because there was so much variation. Ants were always the most interesting to me because of two things. If I found one, I knew I was going to find another one. But it was also very interesting to me that I could watch them do things in real time. I could observe their behavior. And many of the things they do have similarities to behaviors that we understand when they're fighting a battle, when they're gathering food, or any of those things.
Welcome to Who's Missing, a podcast that gets you thinking about who's missing from your world, at work and in life. Today, we're talking to Dr. Corrie Moreau. She is an evolutionary biologist with a specialty in myrmecology. Do you know what that is? Probably not, but maybe you do. And if you're the person who knew, I want to hear from you because you're definitely cool by default. It is the study of ants. She is the CALS Senior Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Cornell University, the founder and co-chair of Chicago's Field Museum's Women in Science, and she has a PhD in evolutionary biology from none other than Harvard. She joins us today to discuss being a first-generation college student, empowering women to pursue careers in science, and, of course, ants and bugs. And look, I'm not necessarily into either, but I am definitely really into her. And her passion for all of the above is truly contagious. You're really going to enjoy our chat. When I think of Corrie, the word that comes to mind is empowerment. I'm Emily Drake, and this is Who's Missing?
To be a little vibrant. It's spring. I wanted to pop.
Yeah. How does spring show up for you?
Longer days, which is great.
Yeah. Are you a night owl or a morning dove? What's your...
Oh, I am so morning person. Oh, for
Are you?
Sure. Oh, yeah. Ever since I was a kid. In fact, I used to hate to have sleepovers at friends' houses because I was up before anyone, including the parents. So I would just lay there quietly until I'd hear the parents stirring. And then I would know I could get up and go in the kitchen. But I also knew don't talk to the parents till they've had their coffee. So I would just sit there and read or do a coloring book or something.
Yes. Here's what I know about you. So we met under the auspices of leadership in Chicago. You were working at the Field Museum. You were a part of a leadership academy. So this is probably 6-7 years ago. I was facilitating. I just remember you. I've never forgotten you.
I feel the same thing about you.
Do you?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
I feel like we just had such great, fun, authentic conversations.
We did. Do you remember anything we talked about, or do you just remember how we felt talking to each other?
I remember one conversation we had because this is when I was sharing that because at that point, my partner, he still was having to be outside of the country a lot, so we couldn't always be together. And so one of the ways we would connect is over music, because I love music and he loves music. And so we would create these playlists. And usually it was I'd create a playlist for him, then he'd create a playlist for me. And then at one point, I'd created a playlist, but he started dropping songs in between that matched the song or was the opposite of the song. And you were like, oh my God, a co-created mixtape is the coolest thing I've ever heard of. And I just remembered you were so excited about it.
Oh my God. I love it. And now I could drop a link to the chat of a playlist that's collaborative between 100 people.
I know.
Oh my
it's
gosh.
Very different.
All right. I am thrilled to talk to you today. I have been going deep on everything about you. Not to say that I haven't been following you, but I've just been thinking about you in a really intentional way. And I watched the video of you at the Field Museum that the Nat Geo profile used. So you are an evolutionary biologist. I just know you as Corrie. But, that's the funny thing, right? Is that's the most important part of it. And then there's all these other things to you, right? Yeah. An evolutionary biologist, a myrmecologist, and you have some, impressive credentials. that I think people will sort of like perk up and think about. So PhD from Harvard, teach at Cornell. And then there's this, you said you're talking about leadership. So the Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. Part of me wants to say, where do you want to start? But can you tell us a bit about what drew you to evolutionary biology initially, and ants in particular, and then I'm going to come back to diversity, equity, and inclusion for sure.
Sure. So I grew up in New Orleans. I'm from New Orleans, and I'm a first-generation college student. Neither of my parents went to college. I grew up well below the poverty line. I grew up in low-income housing in Louisiana. I went to Louisiana public schools. I say all this because I didn't come from a place of privilege where I knew that this could be a job I could have. I just knew I loved nature. I thought, the natural world was the coolest thing. And I think I was drawn to evolutionary biology because I wanted to understand all that complexity. And when I say complexity, of course, like a lot of my work now is like in the Amazon rainforest, or it's in Southeast Asia or in Africa or in Australia. But growing up, it was the cracks of the sidewalk in the city of New Orleans. And even there's just so much biological diversity and interconnections. There's the weeds crawling, growing between the, cracks in the sidewalk. There's these old, beautiful oak trees. There's pigeons. There's ants everywhere. There's crickets. I mean, you name it. And I just sort of was in awe of the fact there was just so much out there, and how did it all come to be? Mm-hmm. And so I think that's kind of how I started down my career path, was I just wanted to understand what I saw outside. I spent enough time, in the field with other kinds of biologists. The way we look at the natural world is very different. So like when I was in grad school, I did a lot of work with someone who worked on these arboreal mammals and birds. Mm. So everywhere we walked, she was looking up, and me, everywhere I walk, I'm looking down, because I'm always looking for the ants and the bugs. And so it's like totally two different ways of looking at the forest.
So this experience of looking down, looking up, looking down, it's something, I think also about how we work. It's like sometimes we're just like this, and sometimes we're in this mode. But it occurs to me as I'm talking to you, you can look down and also be in receive mode. So you look down as a kid, you're looking at all this stuff, and then ants, that journey feels like it was a little bit of a winding road, but maybe not.
I always loved bugs. I thought they were just so fascinating because there was so much variation.
Yeah.
And I had spiders in jars and beetles, and I kept it all. But ants were always the most interesting to me because of two things. If I found one, I knew I was going to find another one. So I might find a really beautiful beetle and not see another one till the next year. Mm-hmm. Where if I found one ant, I knew I was going to find more. But it was also very interesting to me that I could watch them do things in real time. I could observe their behavior. And of course, many of the things they do have similarities to behaviors that we understand. So you sort of can easily get caught up in the, trying to figure out what's happening when they're out and about, when they're fighting a battle, when they're gathering food, or any of those things. So I think to me it was the social aspect, the fact I could watch them in real time just sucked me in.
Yeah. You're a first-generation college student, observably kind of a curious young person. And so how did you find maybe the community to support you in adventuring into higher education, getting your degree, really making this a thing,
Yeah, I didn't know it was a thing. My mom, when I was young, just would always tell me, you have to go to college so you don't have to work as hard as me. That's all I knew. And the only people I knew with college degrees were my high school teachers. So I thought, because I loved bugs and I loved science, I'm going to go to college, and I'm either going to become a high school biology teacher, or maybe I can get a job at a pest control company. That's what I thought were the only two options before I went. I didn't really have any kind of understanding. I was really fortunate because in my first year, one of the TAs who was in charge of one of my classes knew I was crazy about insects and was like, you have to take this new class that's starting next year. It's only for upper level students, but I bet if we've talked to the professor, he'll let you enroll early. So she took me over to meet him when I was still a freshman. And so by sophomore year, I was already enrolled in this class. I was already working in his lab, and it opened up my eyes to the fact that science can be done in such a myriad of ways and with so many different kinds of tools. And, at that point, I didn't really even understand things like genomics or microbiomes. And now that's what I spend all of my research time doing, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think it was just this having your eyes opened to all the opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, and it occurs to me how experiential that really is. And also in your current role as Associate Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, I'm thinking about what you said at the beginning about other voices and your job being to use your platform to empower others. How has it changed, you suppose, for a girl or someone identifying as, I'm not a white dude with like messy hair and glasses, right? But I want to get into science. How has it changed? What have you seen that's marks of progress?
Clearly, the gender equity gap has closed significantly since I started in school. That's such a bright spot because it gives us hope, right? We know we can continue to make change because we have made change.
Yeah.
We're not there yet, right? And so we're not at 50-50 or 48-48 or whatever we should be once we take into account non-binary people, which we have not been documenting very well. So we don't even understand what the proportion of non-binary individuals should be within our fields. But we still see there's disparity, especially at the higher levels and in leadership for representation of even women. So we're not there yet, but I have a lot of hope because we've made such substantial progress.
Yeah. You have been compared to, in the same breath, Jane Goodall, which is a pretty incredible comparison. How do you receive that comparison?
I mean, one, it's like, gosh, wow, you know what I mean? Like,
let's just say what it is. It's like, whoa.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the first thought. But then, of course, the human mind, you tend to do one of two things, at least in mine, I can't speak for all humans, is that I immediately start to think of all the things I haven't done that I think don't make me in the same category. And then on the other side, I think of all the things that are available to me now that were not available to her. And so in some ways I've made more progress than she has, right? And so I it's a hard one.
When you think about empowerment, which I know is a real through line for you and something that I've observed, what do you have to say to someone who's like, gosh, Dr. Moreau, she's so confident. How did you get to be so confident? How do you answer a question like that?
A few years ago, I actually had one of the students ask me, Corrie, I have to tell you, I've always wanted to meet you. I follow your work, I struggle with imposter syndrome a lot. How did you get past imposter syndrome? And I literally looked at them and I was like, wait, past it? I still have imposter syndrome. I will probably have imposter syndrome till the day I die. Every person has imposter syndrome. I think the way I think about it is that through experiences now and proving myself over and over again to myself, not to others, right? To myself, my imposter syndrome, the way it manifests for me is kind of like a little voice in my head. Now my imposter syndrome voice is less frequent, it's less harsh, and it's less loud.
Yeah. It's
still there. And it's easier for me to ignore and turn off, but I think the confidence just comes with challenges, right? And I don't mean ones that other people set for you. It's the goals you set for yourself and you see that you can pass those. So you set another goal, right? And for me, that's the way I've built confidence through time.
Dr. Corrie Moreau's choice for this week's Spotlight is the Cornell University Insect Collection, a world-class research and training collection that includes over 7 million insect specimens, representing 200,000 species, or about 20% of the world's insect fauna. There's a lot of insects in the world. If you'd like to learn more, visit www.cuic.entomology.cornell.edu. Look, I know that website is a bit tricky, so if it's easier, you can also find it, of course, at who'smissingpodcast.com under the Resources tab. And now, back to the show. But at the end of the day, how do you know it was a good day for you?
End of the day, a great day is I feel like I've accomplished at least one thing, maybe more. There are more, it's usually very small things versus one large.
Yeah.
And I don't have that nagging voice in my head telling me oh, you shouldn't have used that tone, or why did you say that at that time? And you really need to think about when you're getting into these situations being more prepared, right? That's when I know when I walk back to, I'm getting my way home, if I don't have that voice going at all in my head and I'm thinking of a few things I've accomplished, that's a great day.
Yeah. The accomplishing something, I think, is something I really know about you. This drive to like educate yourself and then do something about it versus like staying in the thought process. I'm curious though, part of what your journey has been is, moving from the field into the lab and then into leadership, right? So I'm wondering, as you look back, what are some sort of favorite stories or memories from your time out in the field?
They're not aha moments because you haven't figured something out. But I always say that I get my biggest inspiration for new scientific questions while I'm out in nature, right? Because I go out, I've already designed a project. I already know what I'm going to do when I'm there. So while you're there, you're doing your experiments or you're collecting your samples or whatever it is. But while you're there, you start noticing a few other things. And then all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, I don't know that. And I wonder if anyone does. So then you get a little time to do your research, read through the scientific literature, chat with colleagues. And what you'll find more often than not is, no one knows that either. So there's like a whole new avenue. So I sort of joke that every time you you never actually finish anything in science, but you get to where you're putting a bow on it for at least the time being, 5 more questions have opened up. And so I just love that moment of like, I'm standing in the middle of the rainforest trying to figure out a question of like, how did ants become so diverse and how did that get shaped by their symbiotic interactions, right? And I remember just sitting there and watching them taking nectar from plants and then tending some sap-sucking insects and thinking about the impact that plants have on ants, both directly and indirectly, in a way that I hadn't set out to do, right? I went to the rainforest to study ants, and then suddenly now I was studying plants and ants, and the way they were interacting with each other, and I just couldn't have planned that without being there.
I was, again, listening to the pre-interview with Christina, our producer, and, she was you were talking about PBS. I actually felt in my heart like a little bit of a softening. When you think about the role of, I guess, sort of like pop culture in the world of science. But I'm thinking about Morley Safer's, like, what was his show called?
Into the Wild.
Something like that. And the Nature, of course. I mean, I also got the Nat Geo magazines and I would like write in them and my parents would be really upset about me. But when you think about like science, young women in particular, and the LGBTQIA plus crowd accessing science, and you think about how we currently get exposed to it, what do you like that's out there? Where do you feel like there's room for improvement?
My comment earlier to your producer was,
that
I watched every show on nature, like on PBS, right? Every nature show on PBS was just like, there was no Animal Planet, there was no Discovery Channel yet, so that's all I had. I was glued to PBS. It was really important, informative years. I learned a lot, but I also thought at that point that there were probably like 100 scientists in the world. They were all on PBS, and that's all we needed, right? So that's part of the reason I didn't really know that I could become a scientist. Also, most of them kind of all looked the same, right? And I would say what I really love is that, one, our society is demanding that our icons, whether they're pop stars, whether they're scientists, whether they're politicians, they need to start reflecting us more as a society. And I also think that the internet has really facilitated that, whether it's that people have podcasts or YouTube channels or just social media. I know people who have essentially making an entire career showing the world that scientists can look like anybody and that they're doing this amazing work out there. And so I'm also hopeful that it's going to start to bleed into the more traditional ways that we watch scientific content. In fact, one of my very good friends, I'm going to give a plug, he has a new show coming out on PBS. His name is Shane Campbell Staton, and he is awesome. And I can't wait. It's supposed to be coming out this spring or early summer, and he's just a force. He's so smart, but also the way he thinks about the world is so cool. And to be able to get the opportunity to look at the natural world through his lens, and his lens is really about the interaction between nature and human societies. And so it's going to be phenomenal. Definitely watch it. But like, to me, that's where I'm like, he's going to essentially inspire an entire new generation of people who are going to want to be just like him, right?
Yeah.
And that's so cool.
It is so cool. It sounds like education and empowerment are, sort of guiding forces for you. Are you in the classroom at all, ever, anymore? What are you doing?
Yeah, of course. I had always wanted to develop a course and just decided now was the time. So I teach a class. The title of it is called Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, the Science Behind Bias in STEM. So STEM is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And essentially what this class is we're reading from the primary scientific literature about what does the scientific data say about racism, exclusion, and bias in STEM. And so we start out the beginning of the class reading from a little bit of historical context just to set the stage, because really what I want to talk about is what's happening now. But we have to set the stage. So we talk a little bit about how Black women slaves were used for experimentation, and that actually pushed forward the entire field of gynecology, and much of what we still know and do today is based on that forced experimentation. We talk about how, although people often think of the most egregious acts of racism happening during Nazi Germany, but that actually was formed based here on eugenics in the United States, and we sterilized like 60,000 people right here in America, and the Nazis learned from us and then used our tools. I want the students to understand that there's a history behind science not always being used for good, even if we benefit from things like the medical advances we made. And then we jump into what does the literature say today? And so we look across many identities. So like, what does the literature say about women in STEM, about LGBTQIA plus individuals in STEM, people with disabilities in STEM, BIPOC individuals in STEM, first generation college students in STEM. So we read what does the literature say about who's being included and who's being excluded at every level of science. Then we sort of round out the semester with a little hope. So we read a little bit from like what advances we've made, but then it becomes this almost accountability piece where we read from best practices of what we should do as individuals, groups, and organizations to ensure that we're eliminating bias, racism, and STEM going forward. And so it's a really fun class to teach. The students get so engaged and they're so passionate about it. And so that's one I will continue to teach probably forever.
Oh my gosh, I would love to audit that class. All right, I know you've got a few minutes left, so let's think about, and I'm dying to know what you're going to say here, some thoughts on kind of like where you'd like to leave people with this conversation, in terms of this is for someone who's driving to their office and they're listening to this podcast and they're like, gosh, I'd love a next step. Like, what would be some things you'd like them to explore?
Educate yourself. And I know that that's a tall order and it's not easy and you never get to stop. And that's the part that's so non-satisfying. It's not like in school where you got to take a test and you got an A and then you're like, okay, I'm moving to next grade. No, this work around understanding the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion and belonging and justice, you can never stop learning. And it's gonna be hard and you're gonna feel like a bad human sometimes and you're gonna make mistakes and that's okay. And I would say, remember that if you make a mistake, apologize. It's not about your intention. It doesn't mean that you didn't mean to make a mistake or you didn't mean to harm someone. It doesn't matter. Just apologize and then go and educate yourself some more. And learn where are the areas that adding this component of knowledge would actually lead to more growth. I think in leadership, the writing on the wall is clear, right? We know that there's all kinds of tangible benefits. But to me, those are the least important. I would say think about the ethical components, about having an environment where everyone is treated the same and equally, and everyone feels comfortable showing up just as themselves. And also keep learning where your own biases are. I know where some of mine are, but I'm gonna keep uncovering them, right? And so checking yourself. Every time you see your bias starting to, kind of well up, checking it. And then you'll learn that you can start to help check other individuals. And I don't mean in a rude way, but helping them understand that what they're doing might be creating a hostile work environment or might come across as a microaggression. And really no microaggression is actually micro, they're all macro. But understanding how that harm has lasting benefits for the person who's the target of them.
Absolutely. Remember that you're a part of like a big, big, big old system that we're all fumbling through. I mean, I don't know. I really don't know what's coming next, but I'm grateful to fumble with people like you. What's the rest of your day like? I know we're at time, just about, but...
Rest of my day. Today,
do you have
I still
packed meetings?
I do.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I have one of those calendars that you would cringe if you saw.
I would.
But the thing is, I love to be busy, so packed calendar to me is totally fine. But it does mean I need to have my evenings and at least some of my weekends for rejuvenation. So I will have a packed calendar the rest of the day. Then I will go home and I will see my amazing partner, husband, Christoph. Then I get to play with my 2 adorable French bulldogs, Pork Chop and Peanut. And then it started during the pandemic. But some of our closest friends, which both live elsewhere in the world, we have a happy hour on Zoom every Tuesday, so I get to see some of my friends. And then we'll round out the evening with a glass of wine and watching some television or a movie.
I love it. I love it. And I love you. Thank you for being a part of us.
Oh, I love you too.
Oh, yay! Huge fan. Keep being great. And if we can be helpful in any way, let me know.
Will do. I appreciate that.
As always, thank you so much for listening to Who's Missing. If you like this podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review. It only takes a few seconds and truly makes a huge difference. And if you want to hear from us more than just once a week, you can follow us on Instagram or check out our website where you can subscribe to our newsletter, read about our guests, check out a bunch of awesome resources, or send us a message if you have questions or comments. Feedback is welcome. Sounds great, right? Yeah, join us. What are you waiting for? Visit us at www.who'smissingpodcast.com or on IG at Who's Missing Podcast. Talk to you soon.